What if I told you that England's most feared and powerful king didn't die peacefully in a grand royal chamber, surrounded by noblemen and priests murmuring prayers, but instead died howling in agony, rotting from the inside out, vomiting black bile, while convulsing so violently it broke his bed, only for his corpse to later swell, burst open, and leak putrid fluid that stray dogs licked off the stone floor of a desecrated chapel. You would think it's a horror movie script or some exaggerated propaganda conjured by enemies of the crown, but this is no fiction. No, rumor. No, whispered myth. This is what really happened to Henry VIII. And it's a story that the Tudor court buried for more than 4 centuries. A tale so gruesome, so humiliating, and so corrosive to the legacy of monarchy itself that even his own son ordered parts of the truth painted over literally. We begin not at the beginning of Henry's reign, nor at the height of his glory, but at the grotesque and almost unbelievable end when a body, swollen by disease and rage, began decomposing at such a terrifying rate that no amount of perfume, tar, herbs, or silence could mask what had become of the man once called the handsomest prince in Christendom. When the massive lead-lined coffin sealed with wax, packed with salt, reinforced to bear the weight of a man who had ballooned to over 400 pounds, finally cracked under the pressure of internal gases. The witnesses described the sound like a cannon blast echoing through the chapel walls of Sion Abbey, a place of sacred silence, now violated by the smell of royal rot, the gurgle of leaking corruption, and the pitter-patter of scavenger dogs drawn by the scent of death. That single moment, the explosion of Henry's coffin, stands not just as a literal event, but as a symbol of everything that had unraveled inside that man, the explosion of empire, of marriages, of sanity, of flesh, of divinity itself. For here was a king who claimed the divine right to rule, who broke from the Pope, who executed wives like chess pieces, who declared himself head of the Church of England, and yet ended not with hymns or candles, but as something feral and foul, left in the dark of night to be consumed by dogs. But even that horror wasn't the worst of it. Because the truth is, Henry VIII didn't just die badly. He lived his last decade in a nightmare of physical and mental disintegration that the court did everything in its power to conceal. He was no longer a man, but a moving corpse. Leaking, screaming, hallucinating ghosts and flames, swinging between violent rage and desperate pleas for forgiveness from dead wives and unborn children he could never bring back. He sat propped up by servants, unable to walk, unable to dress himself, demanding that servants taste his medicines first, terrified of poison, his eyes yellowed with liver failure, his legs split open by infected ulcers that spilled pus like rivers, his breath, reeking of meat, left in the sun too long, his tongue so swollen near the end that he could no longer form full sentences, reduced to wet gurgles that had to be interpreted by terrified attendants. This was a man who once commanded armies, who stood as a symbol of national strength, who debated theology in Latin and danced until dawn, now lying in a bed surrounded by the stench of death, barking orders that no one wanted to carry out, hallucinating his dead brother Arthur, apologizing for stealing his throne and his bride, begging his mother to protect him from the demons he claimed were crawling up from beneath his mattress. And, in the final insult to the myth of royal power, trying with one trembling hand to sign a death warrant for the Duke of Norfolk, while in the throes of what modern physicians now recognize as organ failure, brain swelling, and a full psychotic break brought on by years of chronic blood poisoning from his own infected legs. And yet, the court, desperate to preserve the illusion of control, told the world he died peacefully in his sleep, clutching the cross, whispering prayers, surrounded by love and grace. They released proclamations of royal dignity and orchestrated a funeral procession that looked majestic from the outside. But behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Embalmers fainted when they opened the body to remove the organs and found that the liver disintegrated at a touch. The intestines had turned black with gangrene. The heart was floating in yellow fluid. The skin was so toxic and bloated, it began leaking through the wax cloth I meant to hold it in, and so they packed the cavity with anything they could find, sealed it again, and hoped no one would notice the bulging lead, the disturbing sounds, the unholy smell, and the terrifying truth that the king was still coming apart, even in death. And then, at Sion Abbey, the lie literally split open. In the middle of the night, with no guards willing to remain near the unbearable stench, the coffin cracked, the fluid poured out, and by dawn, dogs were found lapping at what remained of the once glorious King of England. The scene was so unspeakable that Edward Seymour, now Lord Protector, ordered all witnesses to remain silent on pain of death. The coffin was hastily resealed, the chapel floor scrubbed with lime and sawdust, the lead hammered back down, and the procession forced to continue on to Windsor, where Henry was buried quickly and without the ceremony originally planned. This is not the story written in the history books or shown in museum portraits. This is the real ending. The rotting, screaming, cursed truth of a man consumed by his own power, his own paranoia, and eventually, by his own body, a man who rewrote the laws of heaven but couldn't escape the consequences of the flesh, and whose corpse became too grotesque for even his enemies to mock publicly. This was the moment England learned that even kings, even the most divine among men, bleed, swell, rot, and are ultimately no match for time, infection, and silence. And this was just the beginning. In part 2, we go back to where it all began, to the golden boy Henry, the handsome scholar warrior, the Renaissance dream, and begin to trace the slow, festering transformation that turned him from Europe's golden prince into the bloated ghost of a crumbling empire. Because the corpse may have exploded at the end, but the rot had started long before. Before the madness, before the rot, before the screaming, the ulcers, and the dogs licking at his spilled remains, there was a boy, and not just any boy, but one whom an entire empire believed to be born of divine right, a shining symbol of strength, promise, and providence, a golden child wrapped in silk and prophecy, destined not just to rule, but to rewrite the very concept of kingship. And yet, from the moment of his birth, in the year 1491, Henry Tudor, second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was already entangled in a web of expectation so heavy that it would twist his fate beyond recognition and ultimately contribute to the unspeakable horror that would define his death. He was not supposed to be king. That honour belonged to his older brother Arthur, the carefully groomed heir to the Tudor Restoration following the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, a prince whose name evoked legends of Camelot and who, in the eyes of the court, carried England's future in his veins. But when Arthur died suddenly in the spring of the year 1502, barely 16 years old, and only months into his marriage with the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, the succession fell, like a crown too large for a child's head, onto the shoulders of the younger Henry, who was barely 11 at the time, and whose childhood was yanked out from under him by a tide of mourning, politics, and relentless royal duty. From that moment onward, Henry was no longer a boy. He was a symbol, a vessel, an object of national investment, polished daily by tutors and handlers, who carved into him the languages of diplomacy, the rhythm of horseback, the art of debate, the poetry of scripture, and the hard, cold necessity of power. And yet beneath all the pageantry and education, there remained a soft, sensitive youth who adored music, who wrote tender songs and danced with unguarded joy, who admired chivalric tales of knights and honour, and who seemed, for a time, to truly believe that his reign might become a living epic, a kingdom of reason, splendor, and justice. When his father, Henry VII, died in the year 1509, young Henry was just 18 years old. Tall, athletic, charismatic, and dazzling, he spoke multiple languages, fenced with mastery, hunted like a noble of legend, and was declared by Venetian diplomats to be the most handsome ruler in all of Christendom. And for the first decade of his rule, that illusion held strong as he bathed the court in tournaments, intellectual discourse, and dazzling public spectacles, marrying his brother's widow, Catherine, in an act of both duty and supposed affection, and for a time, projecting to the world the image of a Renaissance monarch who was both enlightened and invincible. But inside that golden frame, cracks had already begun to form, not the kind that show on the skin, not yet, but those more dangerous ones that appear in the mind, in the soul. In the very idea of oneself for Henry was a man increasingly haunted by legacies, the pressure to produce a male heir, the growing whispers that his marriage to his brother's wife might be cursed, the slow realization that his control over the church in Rome was not as absolute as his father's over England, and most of all, the unbearable silence of Catherine's womb, which after multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, yielded only one living child, a daughter, Mary, born in the year 1516, whom Henry would both love and later disown when the pursuit of a son became an obsession louder than blood. And here, the curse began to bloom. When Henry turned to Anne Boleyn, a lady of the court with a sharp mind and sharper ambition, what followed was not just a scandal of the flesh or a clash of personalities. It was the beginning of a transformation that would erode the golden boy from within, for in his desire to cast off Catherine and marry Anne, Henry did not merely request a papal annulment, he waged war against the very institution that had crowned him king, breaking England from the Catholic Church, establishing himself as supreme head of the Church of England, and plunging his realm into theological chaos. Monasteries were dissolved, prelates destroyed, priests executed, and across the land, the scent of holy oil gave way to the smoke of burning parchment and the sound of hammers breaking stained glass. It was not enough. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, another daughter, and with every year that passed without a son, Henry's frustration metastasized into fury, and his once gentle eyes darkened with suspicion. Advisors began to disappear. Old friends were beheaded, and Anne herself, accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, was executed in the year 1536, just 3 years after her coronation. Her body buried without ceremony, while Henry celebrated his next wedding only days later. But what most people forget is that this was the same year as the jousting accident, the one that would mark the true point of no return in the 40 downward spiral of Henry's body, brain, and soul. The accident at Greenwich Palace in January of that year was brutal. Henry, now in his mid-40s but still addicted to the spectacle of masculine prowess, rode his warhorse into the tilt-yard with all the weight of metal and ego. The moment could carry but a miscalculation in timing, or perhaps a tragic twist of fate, caused him to be thrown violently to the frozen ground. And then in front of a silent, horrified crowd, his horse landed squarely on top of him, crushing him beneath hundreds of pounds of flesh and armor. He was unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours in which England had no king. 2 hours in which Anne Boleyn, then heavily pregnant, waited for word that never came. 2 hours in which the future of the entire Tudor dynasty hovered between heartbeat and stillness. And when he finally awoke, something had changed, not in his policies or his plans, but in the wiring of his mind, the bright wit, the Renaissance charm, the joy that once radiated from him like a second sun gone, and in its place, a man consumed by paranoia, mood swings, and violence. a man who, modern neurologists now believe, had suffered significant frontal lobe trauma, the kind that affects empathy, impulse control, and personality. And so, as his mind began to unravel, so too did his body. The reopened wound on his leg previously healed, previously forgotten, now refused to close again. It became infected, ulcerated, unrelenting. He could no longer ride. He could no longer dance. He could no longer kneel. And worst of all, he could no longer hide it. The wound wept endlessly. The pain was unimaginable. And slowly, quietly, relentlessly the rot began. What followed were years of cover-ups, reimagined portraits, reinforced palace floors, manipulated narratives, and forced silence. But the Golden Prince was gone, and in his place was a man who would devour 5 more wives, destroy centuries of religious tradition, and transform from a symbol of divine grace into a bloated shadow of his former self. And no one, not even his most loyal servants, would be able to stop what had begun in that tilt yard, because it wasn't just bone that cracked that day, it was history. And the echo of that fall would be heard for the next 11 years, right up to the moment his coffin exploded. In Part 3, we descend deeper into the medical, mental, and spiritual deterioration that began to take hold after the joust, a slow-motion collapse of man into monster, of mind into madness, of body into horror, and the beginning of a reign ruled not by law or vision, but by pain, blood, and fear. The Golden Boy had become a haunted king, and soon, a walking corpse. By the time England emerged from the long shadows of the year 1536, the Golden Prince, who once dazzled the courts of Europe, was gone, not in name, not in title, but in essence, in spirit. In stability, what remained was a man who ruled not with vision or vitality, but with trembling fury, haunted eyes, and a body that had become a traitor to the throne it once upheld. And while the world continued to call him Majesty, within the high walls of Whitehall, those who truly served him began to whisper of something far more terrifying. The king was in agony, and that agony had begun to think for him. The jousting accident, so casually footnoted in many histories, was in fact the epicenter of a slow earthquake that would shake the foundation of Tudor England for more than a decade, because it wasn't just bones that cracked beneath the weight of that armored horse. Nor was it simply a leg that reopened, nor even just a man that fell. It was the very idea of Henry himself, his mind. Once quick and sharp, had suffered a trauma that even modern neurology struggles to explain in full, but whose effects were all too clear to those who lived through it. The light had gone out in his gaze, and what replaced it was something darker, something unstable, something no longer fully human. Before the fall, Henry VIII had been many things: a scholar fluent in multiple languages, a composer of courtly music, appassionate lover, a capable ruler known for bursts of unexpected mercy and philosophical debate. After the fall, that man existed only in memory. What emerged from the tilt yard was a monarch gripped by suspicion, paranoia, and violent mood swings that swung from weeping like a child in the night to ordering the execution of nobles at dawn without a second thought. Those closest to him described an unpredictability that chilled even the most hardened courtiers, as if they now served not a king, but a storm that could change direction without warning and leave only ruin behind. And underneath that psychological collapse, something far more literal and visible began to take form: the leg wound. That cruel souvenir from his younger jousting days had torn open anew with the force of the accident. But unlike in years past, this time it refused to heal. Physicians of the Tudor court, limited by the medicine of their age and terrified of incurring the king's wrath, tried poultices, oils, bindings, compresses, even leeches. But nothing worked worse still. Henry, with his growing paranoia and obsession with maintaining appearances, he began to experiment on himself. He ordered specially weighted garters to be strapped around the leg, believing pressure would close the wound. But all it did was worsen the circulation and deepen the infection. Soon, the ulcer grew into a gaping sore not just on one leg, but on both a pair of oozing, swollen craters that never closed, never scabbed, and never stopped producing. Pus, they wept through his stockings, soaked into the linens of his bed, filled the chamber with a stench so vile that servants would vomit in corners or excuse themselves with trembling hands. And yet still, the king insisted on being seen, on being painted as strong and upright, on commanding from a throne, while his legs were being drained into bowls hidden behind silk screens. And as the infection grew, it spread. Modern physicians looking back on these reports now speak of chronic osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that cannot be removed without surgery. But in Henry's day, there was no such thing as surgery for such wounds. And so the poison began to travel through his body, day by day, month by month. Rotting him from the inside out, it seeped into his bloodstream, into his joints, into his brain. It weakened his organs, inflated his belly, distorted his vision, and most disturbingly of all, it fractured what little remained of his grip on reality. There were nights when the king, drenched in sweat, would cry out for dead relatives. Sometimes for his long-dead brother Arthur, other times for his mother, begging her to protect him from the shadows crawling across his ceiling. Other times he would speak to the ghosts of wives he had executed. He would argue with Anne Boleyn, laugh as if hearing her voice mocking him, then scream for silence, then whisper threats into the empty air, then fall still, eyes wide open, as if reliving every moment of betrayal he himself had caused. But not all his madness was private. Those who served him began to notice changes in state affairs, once measured and deliberate in matters of diplomacy and governance. Henry, now ruled by impulse allies, became enemies overnight. Reforms were reversed. Treaties burned. Men who had served loyally for years were accused of treason on the basis of a glance, a cough, a rumor. Executions became spectacles again. Not just punishment, but proof that the king still held the power to end lives at will. And those in the court developed a silent system of survival, communicating the king's mood through ribbons on their clothing: red for danger, white for calm, black for depression, a silent language of fear that spread from page to page, lady to lady, noble to noble. Meanwhile, the king's physical transformation became impossible to ignore. The man who had once leapt over moats and danced through banquets was now too large to mount a horse without help, too stiff to kneel, too swollen to sit in most chairs. His armor, once tailored to a slender waist of 32 inches, now had to be remade again and again. With surviving suits showing waistlines of over 54 inches, doorways were widened, floors reinforced, chairs rebuilt. The palace itself was reshaped to accommodate the collapsing empire of his body. As if the kingdom had to bend to carry the weight of the man who could no longer carry himself. And yet he continued to reign not as a beacon of wisdom or justice, but as a tyrant made of pain. A monarch whose every decision was filtered through the haze of infection, narcotics, fever, and fear. A man who believed himself surrounded by enemies and shadows, who tested his food obsessively for poison, who forced servants to try his ointments on their own skin before allowing them to touch his wounds, who refused to let even the court painters show the truth of his condition, ordering portraits that displayed legs that no longer functioned, a stance that no longer existed, and eyes that had long since lost their light. Even his most intimate relationships could not survive the madness. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died in childbirth. His fourth, Anne of Cleves, was annulled in a matter of months. His fifth, the young and frightened Catherine Howard, was executed for infidelity, and his sixth, Catherine Parr, survived only because she learned how to navigate his moods with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, never contradicting him, never confronting him, soothing him like a nurse does a patient too ill to understand the world is no longer under his control. And behind closed doors, the king raged. He raged at pain, at time, at memory, at betrayal. He raged at God, at ghosts, at ministers, at mirrors that dared show him what he had become. He raged at the smell of his own body, at the silk sheets that stuck to his legs, at the weight of his limbs, the roar of his ulcers, the burning of his belly. He raged, because deep down, he knew the truth. He had not just failed to preserve his empire, he had become the very ruin he once promised to protect it from. By the early months of the year, 1544, those who remained loyal knew the end was no longer a matter of if, but when, and worse, they knew that when it came, it would not be clean. It would not be quiet. And it would not be holy, because something had taken hold of Henry VIII. Something deeper than age. Something crueler than illness. Something more vengeful than time. And it was not letting go. In part 4, we will walk alongside the king into the final descent, into the hallucinations. The cychers, the deathbed that became a battlefield, the servants who wept while dressing him, the ministers who fled when he screamed, the records that were burned, and the secrets so disturbing they would be locked away for centuries, because the rot was no longer inside him by then. It had already begun to consume the entire court. There are deaths that come like a thief in the night, silent, sudden, leaving only the stillness of surprise in their wake. And then there are deaths that drag their victims screaming through every corridor of agony, that gnaw at the body piece by piece, that erode the soul before the breath, and that turn even the simplest act of dying into a spectacle of torment. And this was the death that came for Henry VIII. Not with mercy, not with dignity, but with rot, delirium, and the kind of slow-burning horror that made his courtiers pray not for his recovery, but for the end to finally come. By the year 1544, the king had become something that the court no longer knew how to serve. He was no longer just a monarch weighed down by age. He was a creature of contradiction, monstrous yet fragile, commanding yet barely able to stand, feared by all and yet utterly alone. And the worst part was that he was still alive, still breathing, still issuing orders through swollen lips, still signing executions with trembling hands, still pretending, or perhaps genuinely believing, that he remained the same lion-hearted king who had once dazzled Europe with his intellect, his virility, and his impossible will. But behind the curtains, behind the perfume-drenched halls and the scripted court announcements that assured the people of England that their sovereign was merely resting, Henry was decomposing while still drawing breath, the ulcers on his legs. Once the subject of whispered complaints among servants, had now reached a state that defied language. The flesh around the wounds had turned black, brittle, and sour-smelling. The skin split open in multiple places, revealing layers of tissue too raw to endure even the brush of linen. And the discharge, no longer simply pus, had evolved into a fetid sludge, the color of decay, forcing attendants to change his bandages multiple times a day and burn the cloth immediately to keep the smell from leaking through the walls. Windows in his chambers were kept open, even during the coldest days of winter, not out of luxury but necessity, because the stench was no longer human. It was industrial, unbearable, something closer to a battlefield morgue than a royal bedroom. And yet Henry insisted on pretending, insisted on ceremony, insisted on appearing for council sessions even when he could not sit upright, forcing his ministers to deliver their reports while he lay on his back, propped up with pillows, his face bloated, his hands trembling, his lips cracked with fever, his weight, now exceeding 400 pounds, had become an obstacle not just to mobility but to care. It took 6 men to turn him in bed, a task that was necessary every few hours to prevent the formation of new pressure sores, though by this point his back, buttocks, and thighs were already littered with them, some oozing, others scabbed over in hardened crusts of dead skin and dried blood, all of them feeding the same infection that had begun its march through his blood nearly a decade earlier. And then there was the swelling, his abdomen distended with fluid, his ankles and feet puffed into unrecognizable lumps, his tongue so enlarged from inflammation that he could no longer speak clearly, his voice now a guttural rasp that required long-serving aids to interpret, and even then, interpretation was a guessing game. As Henry's mind now danced along the fraying edges of coherence, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost, sometimes so gripped by hallucination that he would beg his mother to protect him from the men in black robes or scream at ghosts, only he could see standing at the foot of his bed. The mental deterioration, which had begun in subtle shades after the jousting accident, had by now swallowed the man. Entirely ministers recorded him flying into uncontrollable rages when no one had spoken, or bursting into tears at imaginary news, or laughing to himself for hours before collapsing into sleep, only to awaken in terror and demand the arrest of people who had been dead for years. He once ordered an execution warrant for a nobleman who had been buried nearly a decade earlier, and when informed of the mistake, he accused the Privy Council of conspiring to hide the man, convinced the dead were playing tricks on him. The rituals of the court, once the pride of Tudor England, had turned into farce instead of mourning audiences. Pages now gauged the king's mood through his silence, noting the colour of his eyes, the state of his breathing, and whether or not he had vomited blood that morning. Those brave enough to enter his chambers often did so, holding scented handkerchiefs or wax balls soaked in rosewater beneath their noses. And still some could not keep their composure, fainting, gagging, even fleeing from the room, and yet, despite this, the illusion had to be maintained. The court issued statements declaring the king's mind clear and focused, his health improving, and his soul steadfast in the eyes of God. But within the inner circles, it was well known that Henry was dying not just biologically, but symbolically. The very myth of Tudor invincibility was breaking apart under the weight of his body, the burden of his madness, and the unbearable smell of corruption that trailed him like a shadow, even after his clothes had been changed and his wounds redressed. And then came the worst detail of all, the one that Henry himself tried to conceal from everyone, even from his own portrait painter. At some point during these final years, Henry had commissioned a walking stick, not an ordinary cane of royal design, but something far more macabre, a thick wooden staff carved with ornate patterns of death and topped with a human skull. Some said it was the skull of a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries. Others whispered it belonged to a political rival, executed in silence whatever its origin. It became Henry's obsession, a totem he carried with him, even when confined to his chair, tapping it nervously on the floor during meetings, sometimes whispering to it under his breath, as if it could speak back. The infamous Whitehall portrait, painted by Hans Holbein, originally depicted this detail faithfully, the king's left hand gripping the skull-topped cane, as if embracing his own mortality. But after Henry's death, his son Edward, then just a child, ordered the image, altered the skull, erased, replaced with a simple cane, because he could not bear the thought that his father, the man who had remade England, would be remembered not as a lion, but as a skeleton in waiting. But memory is a cruel servant, and paint cannot hold back the truth forever. Modern X-rays of the portrait reveal the outline of the original cane beneath the paint, a phantom image that still lingers beneath the surface. Just as the truth of Henry's death still lingers beneath the surface of history, and as the year 1546 drew to its close, and the king's health plummeted into the realm of crisis, the whispers in the court turned into murmurs, then into quiet planning, then into the desperate construction of a narrative that could shield the crown from what was about to unfold, because what was coming would not be survivable, not for Henry, not for his body, and not for the legacy he had tried so hard to script. In the early days of January, the ulcers on his legs began to smell of rotting meat. The colour of the discharge turned from yellow to green, then to black, then to a thick, sticky brown that defied removal. The fever spiked. The belly swelled. The skin split. His breath became so foul that servants refused to stand beside him. And even physicians began to arrive late, leave early, and speak less. Some stopped recording symptoms altogether, as if the act of writing down his condition made it more real, more monstrous, more unfit for the image of divine kingship that still flickered in the stained glass of the chapel. By mid-January, Henry had become unable to swallow food, his tongue a swollen busridamus, his throat constricted with infection. He communicated only through grunts or failed gestures, and sometimes not at all, and yet even then, even as his flesh split open from the pressure of his own fluids, he would scream when servants tried to remove his crown from the table beside his bed, demanding that it stay where he could see it, as if the sight of it could anchor him, could remind him that he was still king, still alive, still more than a sack of dying meat and broken dreams. But the truth, by then, was undeniable. He was no longer ruling. He was no longer recovering. He was no longer Henry VIII. He was a man being devoured from the inside out. In Part 5, the moment arrives, the final night. The screaming seiches, the black bile, the cracked bed frame, and the Archbishop of Canterbury's secret diary, because the king who couldn't die finally does. But what happens next will horrify you even more. In the cold, unyielding stillness of January's final week in the year 1547, the royal apartments of Whitehall fell into a silence that was not serene but suffocating, a silence so heavy, so unnatural, that even the crackling of fire in the hearth seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to interrupt the slow, violent unravelling of a monarch who had defied popes, beheaded queens, and ruled England with the unshakable certainty that he was chosen by God himself, and yet now, at the end of his reign and the edge of his existence, King Henry VIII lay in a chamber that reeked not of sanctity, but of sickness, not of majesty, but of rot, not of divine favour, but of a punishment so prolonged and pitiless that even his enemies, had they witnessed it, might have turned away in horror. By this point, Henry's body was no longer entirely human. It had transformed into something swollen, cracked, and grotesque, a monstrous parody of the prince he had once been his legs, riddled with ulcers so deep the bone was visible, were bound in layers of cloth that no longer stemmed the flow of infection, but merely absorbed it until they had to be burned. His belly, distended and taut, throbbed with trapped fluid that sloshed audibly when he was moved. His tongue, the very organ that had once composed love letters and political manifestos, now protruded grotesquely, swollen and purple, rendering him incapable of clear speech. And worst of all, his breath, a mixture of rot and bile, carried the unmistakable stench of a digestive system in collapse, a scent that no perfume, no incense, no open window could hide. The physicians who remained at his side had long since abandoned hope of healing, and now served only the ritual of watching the skin split, watching the fever rise and fall like tides pulled by madness, watching the king drift in and out of delusion. And it was in one of those moments of lucidity, one of those brief and terrifying flickers of awareness that rose like smoke from a fire nearly extinguished. That Henry demanded the presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, not out of spiritual desperation, but as a final assertion of control, a last royal summons issued by a man who refused to go quietly into the earth. Cranmer, who had known Henry in the days of his Renaissance prime, who had watched him turn from reformer to tyrant, who had served both as priest and as political tool, arrived at Whitehall just before midnight on January the 27th, bearing not the composure of a clergyman, but the weight of a man who knew that what he was about to witness would change him forever, and what he found upon entering the royal bedchamber was something closer to a battlefield than a deathbed, something closer to hell than holiness. 6 servants were holding the king down, not gently, not reverently, but with the strength required to restrain a man in seizure. Henry's body, massive and bloated, shook with convulsions so violent that the heavy oak frame of his bed had begun to splinter at the joints. He vomited black bile between clenched teeth. His eyes rolled back into his skull, his arms thrashing at invisible enemies, while his voice, or what remained of it, rose in guttural shrieks that contained no words. Only terror, the kind of terror that comes not from the fear of dying, but from the dawning certainty of where one is going. Cranmer, unable to speak, stood for several moments in the doorway, the scent of blood and infection crawling into his throat, forcing him to swallow his own nausea, and when finally he stepped forward, pushing past the exhausted attendants, he took the king's swollen, clammy hand into his own and whispered the question every Protestant must answer before passing, whether he placed his faith in Christ for salvation. And if so, to give a sign, one squeeze, a final gesture, one act of surrender to the God Henry had claimed to serve. Even as he broke his church in 2 plighting, the hand in Cranmer's began to tremble once, twice a squeeze, so faint it might have been a muscle spasm, or it might have been the last spark of belief buried beneath decades of bloodshed and pride, and then nothing. At 2 a.m. on January the 28th, King Henry VIII died, not surrounded by light and prayer, not peacefully with his family by his side, but amidst cracked wood, blood-soaked sheets, the smell of gangrene and burnt linen, and the sound of his own lungs rattling wetly as fluid filled them from within. But the horror did not end with the silence of his breath. In fact, it was only just beginning. Within hours of his death, his body began to change, not subtly, not gradually, but violently. The infection that had ravaged him for years did not stop with death. It accelerated. Now unimpeded by pulse or resistance, his abdomen swelled further. His skin darkened to a sickly shade between yellow and grey. His limbs stiffened at awkward angles, and his mouth, frozen half open, revealed teeth stained black from internal bleeding. The room had to be cleared repeatedly, as servants vomited or fainted from the overwhelming stench. And the Privy Council, which had gathered nearby to plan the transition of power to Edward, refused to enter the chamber, insisting that the doctors handle the preparation for embalming as quickly and quietly as possible. But quickly was not an option. When the embalmers opened the body to remove the organs, they were met with a scene so grotesque that one assistant fainted on the spot, and another ran from the room weeping. The liver, enlarged and fatty, crumbled upon contact. The heart was surrounded by pockets of yellow fluid and had swollen to nearly twice its natural size. The intestines were blackened and fragile with gangrene, and when the stomach was opened, the gases that had built within it released a sound like a cannon, a deafening, wet pop that echoed against the chamber walls, followed by a smell that forced everyone out of the room for over an hour. Desperate to contain what had already become a scandal in the making, the embalmers packed the body with over 100 pounds of salt, resin, herbs, and tar. They wrapped it in waxed cloth, soaked in turpentine, sealed the seams with pitch, and then enclosed it within a specially reinforced lead coffin. The final weight, coffin and corpse together, exceeded 1/2 ton. And even then, the measures failed. The next day, the coffin began to bulge. By the time the public lying in state was ready to begin, the coffin had to be draped with additional cloths to hide its misshapen surface. Attendants reported hearing bubbling and gurgling sounds from within, the result of gases still building pressure inside the sealed lead. And worst of all, a sickly brown liquid began to seep from one corner, prompting the immediate dismissal of all public viewings and the discreet removal of the coffin to a side chapel where it could be guarded until the procession. But the procession brought no dignity either. The journey to Windsor Castle, originally expected to take 1 day, stretched to 3, slowed by heavy rains and the sheer weight of the monstrous coffin. 8 horses strained to pull the carriage through mud-soaked roads while servants walked in silence beside it, terrified of what might happen if the seal ruptured again. And when they reached Sion Abbey on the second night, where the coffin was to rest in the chapel overnight, they placed it gently beneath the high altar and prayed the worst was over. It was not. Sometime in the darkness before dawn, the pressure inside the coffin breached the lead again, this time not with a subtle leak, but with a rupture so loud that guards at the far end of the nave came running. The seal cracked open, and a wave of foul-smelling fluid poured from the base, staining the stone floor, seeping into the cracks, and leaving behind a stench so unbearable that the guards posted nearby abandoned their positions. And it was then, sometime between night and morning, that the dogs came, stray, half-wild, and drawn by a scent no beast could resist. They found their way into the chapel and lapped at the fluid that had spilled from the corpse of England's most powerful king, and by the time the clergy discovered them at sunrise, it was too late. The desecration was complete. The myth was shattered. And the king who had once demanded that the world bend to his will had been consumed by the very earth and animals he believed he ruled. In Punitz, servants scrubbed the floor with lime, burned incense, until the walls wept with smoke, resealed the coffin with molten lead, and swore oaths of silence under threat of death when the procession resumed. No word was spoken of what had occurred, and when the coffin was lowered into the crypt beneath St. George's Chapel in Windsor, it was done with a haste that bordered on fear. No final speech, no farewell blessing, no celebration of glory, only the clang of iron against stone, the hiss of molten sealant, and the smell still lingering. In Part 6, we follow the silence that came after the rewriting of the story, the manipulation of portraits, the deletion of records, the child king forced to inherit a legacy of rot, and the slow, deliberate burial, not just of Henry VIII, but of the truth. When the final slab of stone was lowered into place over the crypt at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, when the last clanging echo of molten lead sealing the coffin had faded into the cold air of that February morning in the year 1547, England did not weep, did not wail, did not raise its voice to the heavens. Instead, it fell into a hush, so heavy it felt engineered, designed, rehearsed a silence, not of mourning, but of containment, not of grief, but of strategy, because those who remained behind knew that what they had buried was not just a man, nor merely a monarch, but something far more dangerous, the evidence of decay at the very heart of power, the terrible truth that kings could rot, that divine rule could die, screaming that the throne itself could stink of human flesh. And so they covered it, not just the coffin, not just the chapel, but the entire legacy. For all the splendor of Henry VIII's long and turbulent reign, there was no grand funeral in the streets, no public display of the coffin, no extended procession lined with wailing subjects. Instead, the ceremony was abbreviated, the viewing limited, the details obscured. Official statements declared that the king had passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by loyal attendants. Having confessed his faith and prepared his soul, the court poets began composing verses of dignity and triumph. Ministers issued proclamations of smooth succession. And the scribes, those who would write the chronicles of the age, received quiet instructions about what should and should not be recorded. Even as the final residue of leaked royal fluids was being scrubbed from the stone floor of Sion Abbey, the machinery of revision was already in motion. The Privy Council, led now by Edward Seymour, newly styled as Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of the realm, moved with clinical speed to shield the boy king Edward VI, barely 9 years old. From the horror of his father's decline, the young monarch was told only that his father had died nobly and had left him a legacy of greatness to uphold. None dared speak of the exploding coffin, of the seizures, of the hallucinations, of the bone-deep ulcers that had oozed into the cloth of the throne itself. And so Edward ascended, not into truth, but into illusion. And that illusion had to be maintained at all costs. One of the earliest acts of the new regime was to commission a careful reworking of the Whitehall portrait, the now famous image of Henry VIII standing broad-shouldered and unyielding, legs apart, eyes fierce, hand on hip, an image that would become iconic for centuries to come. But beneath the oil and canvas, beneath the brushstrokes of power and masculinity, there was another version, an earlier version, one painted by Hans Holbein, that showed something far more unsettling. A king gripping a cane, topped not with a gold finial, but with a human skull, and in the king's expression, something hollow, something unwell. That version was never shown to the public. Edward, unable to bear the grotesque final image of his father, ordered the portrait altered. The skull was painted over, replaced by a simple rod. The sunken eyes brightened. The puffed cheeks slimmed. The result was not a lie, but a monument, a visual fiction that would stand in place of the man, because the man himself had become unusable. But paintings were not the only thing rewritten. Medical notes, private diaries, ambassadorial letters, all of them were gathered, edited, or destroyed. The private records of Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had overseen Henry's final days, were removed from the royal archive and hidden within a private collection, not to resurface until centuries later. The Archbishop Cranmer's diary, where he recorded the seizures, the hallucinations, the whispered plea for forgiveness sealed in the Lambeth Palace Library and mislabeled under a false classification. Even the records of the embalming were scrubbed. The names of the embalmers themselves disappeared from the rolls. The details of the ruptured abdomen, the blackened organs, the bursting lead erased not with ink, but with silence. And this silence spread. Historians writing during the reign of Edward VI avoided the topic of Henry's death almost entirely when they did mention it. They used words like peaceful, divinely timed, or gracious passing. The truth was not just inconvenient. It was dangerous because in a nation barely held together by religious reform, shifting alliances, and fragile succession, the last thing the government could afford was for the people to know that the man who had broken Rome, burned heretics, and crowned himself the head of the church had died, choking on his own corruption, screaming at ghosts, and decomposing before he was even cold. And so they entombed not just his body, but his legacy deep beneath layers of legend, ritual, and propaganda. Schoolbooks would speak of Henry's military victories, of his 6 wives, of the dissolution of the monasteries, and the establishment of the Anglican Church, but they would not speak of his screams. Portraits would show him as immortal wide stance, square shoulders, but they would not show the leg ulcers, the pus-stained robes, the servants collapsing from the smell. Plays would dramatize his passion, his ambition, his cruelty, but not his bloated corpse, bursting open in the night while dogs licked up the residue of his power. For generations, the story held, England remembered Henry as a lion, dangerous, glorious, flawed, but never pathetic, never powerless. It would take centuries the rise of modern medical science, the discovery of forgotten journals, the re-examination of Tudor archives, for the real image to emerge, not of a man who simply died, but of a body that had been dying for over a decade, a soul slowly frayed by disease, madness, and guilt, and a government so terrified of what that death might mean that they silenced it before the body was even cold. But even the best-kept secrets eventually leak. In the year 1891, the suppressed medical notes of Dr. Wendy were rediscovered in a private estate, having survived centuries in a sealed leather case. In the year 1960, a restoration of the Whitehall portrait revealed the skull cane hidden beneath layers of paint, and in the early 1980s, Cranmer's handwritten accounts long ignored were cross-referenced with French diplomatic letters, confirming the terrifying details of Henry's last hours. Piece by piece, the mask cracked, and when it did, what emerged was not a scandal, but a revelation. That power, no matter how absolute, no matter how divine it claims to be, cannot escape the body. That tyranny, no matter how righteous it presents itself, cannot hide the smell of infection forever. That kings, no matter how many wives they behead or how many churches they burn, are still mortal, and sometimes their mortality arrives not as a quiet whisper, but as a scream that echoes through sealed corridors and burns through painted memory. In Part 7, the infection spreads beyond the grave as the kingdom struggles to move on. Shadows of Henry's reign linger in the bodies and minds of those left behind. His daughter Mary will revive the burnings. His daughter Elizabeth will inherit the paranoia. And the Tudor court will learn that no matter how hard you bury the rot, it has a way of rising again. When the last drops of molten lead cooled above the monstrous corpse of Henry VIII, when the vault was sealed beneath the sacred floor of St. George's Chapel, and the dogs had long since been driven from Sion Abbey, England did not awaken to a new era of light and progress. It staggered into a dawn soaked in fear, confusion, and the thick, invisible residue of a legacy that had not ended with death. Because what had truly made Henry dangerous had never been confined to his bones or his throne, or even to the iron clasp of his scepter. It had been in his doctrine, in his delusions, in the poisoned logic of divine entitlement that had justified every execution, every broken marriage, every heresy declared by royal breath. And now, even as the king's body lay rotting beneath the stones, that rot had already crept into the blood of his children, the minds of his council, and the soul of the realm itself. The child who took the crown next was a boy of only 9 years, known to history as Edward VI. But in truth, he was not a ruler, he was a shadow, a marionette, a pale echo of his father's will, preserved and animated by men like Edward Seymour, who as Lord Protector ruled in his name, while the boy's thin hands barely managed to grasp the weight of the crown that had been too heavy, even for a monster. And though the official story told of a smooth transition, of a blessed new beginning guided by Protestant reform and youthful purity, the reality was far more haunted. The court was on edge. Foreign ambassadors whispered of instability, and servants spoke quietly of flickering candles near the crypt, of dreams where the old king's voice still echoed through the corridors. And then came the coughing. Edward VI, frail from birth, and pushed through the machinery of kingship like a porcelain doll through a battlefield. I began to show signs of illness before his 14th birthday. First it was fatigue, then the chills, then the hacking blood that soaked his pillows, and as his body weakened, the physicians, desperate to avoid another royal death, turned to the same measures that had failed his father: bleeding, purging, prayers, and silence. But the rot could not be exorcised with ritual, because it was no longer a physical infection alone, it was psychological. generational, systemic. And by the time the boy king died in the year 1553, just 6 years after taking the throne, England had begun to understand that something deeper was wrong. But the realm would not be allowed to rest. Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the wife whom Henry had cast aside and buried in shame, now claimed her right to rule. And with her came the ghosts of faith and vengeance wrapped in crimson vestments and burning scripture. Mary did not see herself as merely a queen. She saw herself as a weapon of divine correction, a fire sent to purge the heresies that her father had birthed, and with a heart forged in childhood abandonment and humiliation. She turned that fire against her own people. Over the course of her reign, hundreds were burned alive. Protestant clergymen, cholasts, and commoners alike, all condemned as enemies of the true church. All sentenced by a monarch who believed she was healing her country, even as she made it scream, and beneath each flame, beneath each shriek that rose into the soot-stained sky, there was the echo of Henry, because it had been he who taught his heirs that faith was a weapon, that the soul of a nation could be reshaped by fire and decree, and that the pain of others could be justified, if done in the name of divine rule. But Mary did not reign long. By the year 1558, her body, too, began to fail, swollen, racked with pain, and twisted by what modern historians suspect to have been either cancer or a phantom pregnancy. And in those final days, as she lay dying and childless, she reportedly wept, not for her own life, but for the knowledge that the woman who would wear the crown next was her half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose mother she believed had torn England apart. And so Elizabeth became queen. Elizabeth I, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the monarch beneath whose reign England would experience a cultural renaissance and naval triumphs, would inherit not just the crown, but the decay that had poisoned her lineage, because though she dressed herself in golden robes and wrapped her reign in poetic language and regal distance, Elizabeth, like her father, ruled alone, trusted few, and carried within her a deep and unrelenting paranoia. She never married. She never named a successor. She purged her court of those she suspected of treason, surrounded herself with spies, and crafted a public image so carefully curated that no painter was permitted to capture her true features in her later years. The woman whose beauty had once been sung in ballads became, in her final decade, a phantom queen caked in white lead makeup, adorned in wigs and jewels, but hollow-eyed and clenched with suspicion, and those who saw her up close reported that she often sat for hours in silence, gripping the arms of her throne, as if bracing for something that had not yet arrived. Because Elizabeth knew, as Henry had known, as Mary had known, that no matter how high you climb, how many enemies you crush, how many altars you build in your name, the body will betray you, the mind will fray, and the power will slip through your fingers like ash. And so the rot continued. It spread not just through bloodlines, but through the institutions, through a court that normalized cruelty, through ministers trained to lie, through a nation taught to equate obedience with righteousness and silence with strength. It spread through the very foundation of Tudor governance, which had been built not on dialogue or consensus, but on fear, surveillance, spectacle, and the illusion of divine favor. Even long after Elizabeth's death in the year 1603, when the crown passed to the Stuarts and a new dynasty rose from the Scottish hills, the echoes of Henry's rot remained in every secret execution, in every shadowy confession chamber, in every whispered rumor of royal madness, and the crown itself, heavy with jewels and history. I bore the weight not just of tradition, but of unresolved horror. Because Henry had set the standard, he had shown that a king could sever his realm from an ancient church, burn the past, rewrite scripture, and still be worshipped. He had shown that wives could be discarded, friends beheaded, bodies desecrated. And still the people would cheer. He had shown that truth was malleable. That power could make its own reality. And once those truths were unleashed, they could not be undone by death, not even by an agonizing, explosive, unspeakable death. In the centuries that followed, England would tell itself many stories. It would remember the Armada, the poetry of Shakespeare, the glory of empire, the sun that never set. But underneath those stories, the bones of Henry still lay, not just in Windsor, but in the national psyche, a reminder that beneath every portrait of royal strength may lie a cane topped with a skull, and beneath every velvet robe, a body breaking open in the dark. In Part 8, we return to the coffin itself, to the myth that it stayed sealed, to the truth that it did not, to the legend of the rupture at Sion Abbey, to the dogs, the fluid, the aftermath, and to the final, humiliating detail that history tried hardest to hide the moment when a king became a corpse and a corpse became a spectacle. It should have ended at Windsor. It should have ended with stone and silence, with a coffin buried deep beneath the altar of St. George's Chapel, with black cloth draped respectfully over the past, and with England turning its face forward. But the truth, as it had done from the moment Henry VIII took his final breath, refused to stay hidden, refused to be tamed by ceremony or confined by royal decree. Because what happened to the king's body after death was not an unfortunate incident, nor a minor embarrassment. It was the final act in a tragedy that had spanned decades. The violent and uncontainable collapse of a man who had tried to become more than human, and who, in trying, had doomed his legacy to rot from the inside out. The lead coffin, built to withstand the weight and pressure of a body that had already begun decomposing before it had even cooled, was a marvel of Tudor-era mortuary engineering lined with pitch, reinforced with waxed cloth, packed with herbs, wrapped in linen, soaked in tar, and sealed so tightly that even the embalmers whispered that it might be enough to hold back what they had seen spilling from the king's abdomen in those final hours. And yet it was not enough. Not nearly enough. Because the enemy they were fighting was not merely death, but decay active, aggressive, accelerating decay that fed on the very tissue of monarchy and exploded its myths with every gas bubble that built inside the royal corpse. The journey from Whitehall to Windsor was supposed to be a stately procession, a farewell march befitting a sovereign who had ruled for nearly 4 decades. But what it became was a logistical nightmare plagued by mud, weight, and something far more horrifying, the growing realization that the coffin was not stable, that something inside it was alive in the worst possible way, fermenting, warping, whispering through bulges of strained metal and stained cloth. And by the second day of travel, when the cortege reached Sion Abbey, a place heavy with its own ghosts and ironies, the handlers were exhausted, the horses were trembling, and the coffin was leaking. It began with a sound, not a crack, not a snap, but a low, wet thump, a sound that the guards described as a hollow thunderclap, a noise so unnatural, so full of pressure and wetness, that several men stepped back instinctively, unsure whether something inside the coffin had broken or simply burst. And then came the smell, not like rot, but beyond it, a smell thick with bile and old meat, and the kind of bitter chemical tang that no herb or incense could mask. And finally, as the abbey bells marked the hour of matins, the lead itself gave way. The rupture tore along the base of the coffin, a seam that had already begun to strain under pressure, now split open, with just enough force to release what had been building for days, a stream of thick, dark fluid, a mixture of embalming oil, decomposed organ matter, and the liquefied fat of a man whose body had been slowly melting from the inside since the moment his heart stopped. It pooled beneath the bier, soaked the stone, and then dripped between the cracks in the abbey floor, where it would remain for years, its scent lingering in the cold air like a secret that could never be fully exorcised. And it might have remained just a grotesque whisper had it not been for what followed next, because sometime in the hours before dawn, before the coffin could be moved or the floor properly cleaned, the dogs came, not royal hounds, not pets, but strays, lean, silent, half-wild creatures that prowled the outer edges of abbeys and palaces, drawn to fire and to blood, to warmth and to weakness. No one saw them enter. No one heard them climb the steps or slip past the guards asleep on their posts. But in the morning, they were there, crouched in the shadows near the altar, their muzzles wet with something that glistened brown in the candlelight, licking at the puddles that had spilled from the king, who once declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. The scene was discovered by a monk, whose horrified cries awakened the abbey, and what followed was chaos guards, chasing dogs through the nave with torches, servants vomiting behind pillars, attendants scrambling to wipe away the evidence. Before the high-ranking members of the court arrived, lime was thrown across the stones. Incense was burned until it choked the lungs. The coffin was hastily resealed, with additional sheets of hammered lead, and a decree was issued immediately, and without ceremony, no one was to speak of what had happened under pain of death. But some did. A French ambassador, staying nearby, recorded in his private letters that the king's body was opened from below, and that what issued forth made even the holy men recoil, and over the years, the tale would pass quietly among certain monasteries, among certain foreign courts, among the servants who had once touched the hem of Henry's robe and now shuddered at the memory of his final degradation. And it was not just a physical rupture, it was a symbolic one, because in that single moment, that moment when the king's body broke open and spilled its secrets onto the floor of a holy house, the illusion of power as eternal, divine, and untouchable shattered forever. All the portraits, all the proclamations, all the divine rights and titles meant nothing against the truth of a body that could not even hold itself together for 3 days. A body so poisoned, so bloated with unchecked indulgence and unresolved rage, that even in death it refused to rest in dignity. And for the men who had spent decades crafting Henry's myth, the advisors, the artists, the scribes, the rupture at Sion Abbey became an emergency of memory management. The official history would say the king was transported with honor, that the coffin was sealed and undisturbed, that he was buried with the full reverence due to a monarch of his stature. No mention would be made of the fluids, the dogs, the smell, or the fear, and those who had seen it with their own eyes were given 2 options: silence or death. But memory, once contaminated, is difficult to sterilize. Over the centuries, the whispers survived, buried in foreign letters, in misfiled diaries, in the recollections of those who served too close to the crown, and each time the story surfaced, it eroded a little more of the mask that Henry had once worn, reminding the world that the man who had defied popes, who had torn down cathedrals, who had rewritten scripture and reshaped marriage, had ended not in triumph or martyrdom, but in a puddle of his own decay. And even more damning was this, that no monument, no tomb, no epic poem had ever truly erased the image of that final leak, not even the marble markers above his crypt in Windsor, which bear his name alongside Jane Seymour, speak of what really happened on the road there. They do not speak of the dogs. They do not speak of the rupture. They do not speak of the night when England's most powerful man became something less than memory, became scent, became stain, became a warning, etched not in stone, but in the very air of the abbey, where silence still lingers like smoke that refuses to clear. In Part 9, we confront the final question, not how Henry VIII died, but what his death means for power, for memory, for England, and how, even century later, the story we tell about kings may still be rotting beneath the surface. It should have ended with dirt, with the final clink of stone against stone, with the royal sigil lowered into shadow, with priests murmuring verses that few believed and fewer understood, with the echoes fading into the chill of February and England exhaling into a new era. But Henry VIII did not simply die, and England did not simply bury a king what they buried. Hurriedly, and with hands half shaking, was a lie crafted too large to fit inside any tomb. A body swollen not just with disease, but with myth. And when that lie began to leak, quite literally, from the ruptured seams of his coffin and the blackened wounds of his legacy, those left behind did not confront it, did not open the lid to look at what they had created. They did what empires always do when rot begins to show. They turned away. They painted over it. They built new crowns on top of old scars, and called it continuity. Because the truth of Henry's death is not about the smell, or the blood, or the dogs that licked the fluids from the floor. Though all of those are grotesquely real, documented, and unforgettable, the truth is about what we are willing to believe about power. And more importantly, what we are not. We are not willing to believe that a king can rot before our eyes and still issue orders, that he can soil his bed with pus while whispering threats to ghosts, that he can mistake screams for prayers and still be worshipped, that he can be lifted into chairs with ropes because his legs no longer carry him, and still sign death warrants with a hand that trembles like a leaf. We are not willing to believe that a man so broken could still command fear, still hold an entire kingdom in his sweating palm, and that when he finally died, the first response was not grief, but relief. And yet this is what happened. Henry VIII ruled long after he was fit to rule, ruled from bed, from delusion, from a place so consumed by physical agony and spiritual rot that even his most loyal servants developed secret systems of ribbons and glances to warn each other of his moods, ruled through ulcers, hallucinations, dripping bandages, and liquefying tissue, ruled through portraits that lied, through proclamations that praised, through a nation too, afraid of what might come next to question what they still saw on the throne. And when he finally died, there was no rejoicing in the streets, no mourning with open hearts, only the sound of doors closing, of fires being stoked to burn records, of scribes dipping their quills, not in truth, but in survival. And the silence was deafening. It was in the way Edward VI's regime refused to speak of the king's final hours, in the way the Whitehall portrait was altered to erase the skull in Henry's hand, in the way the Privy Council ordered the embalmer's names struck from the rolls, in the way the clergy denied the fluid at Sion Abbey ever existed, in the way Windsor's tombstone bore no mention of the woman who birthed the child buried beside him, in the way ambassadors recorded one story in public and another in private letters, smuggled across the Channel, and perhaps most heartbreakingly, in the way even his children, Mary with her fires, Elizabeth with her masks, tried to govern as if the rot had not passed into their blood. But it had, because power that survives decay does not come out clean. Because when a man spends decades shaping his rule around fear, ego, appetite, and divine pretense, the institution that remains after his death cannot help but reflect the body that housed it, bloated, unstable, terrified of exposure. And the England that emerged in the years after Henry's death was just that: unstable, paranoid, dangerous. It flipped between Catholic and Protestant like a coin tossed in desperation. It swung the sword of justice without aim. It hunted witches, spies, traitors, and dissenters with the same energy Henry had used to hunt wives and rivals. And it refused, for over a century, to look back at the tomb beneath St. George's Chapel and ask, what did we bury? Really? Because to do so would mean acknowledging that the king had become grotesque, not in spite of his power, but because of it. That the unchecked authority, the divine self-image, the refusal to be corrected or contradicted, all of it had bloated him, poisoned him, fractured his mind and body until what remained was not a leader, but a cautionary tale wrapped in crimson cloth, and that maybe, just maybe, the rot did not begin with the ulcers or the fall from the horse, but from the moment he began to believe his body was an extension of God's will. And here lies the deepest wound of all that centuries later. We still flinch from this story. We still prefer the portraits, the strong legs, the firm gaze, the gloved hand resting on a sword. We still speak of the 6 wives as curiosities, of the break with Rome as clever politics, of the burning of monasteries as a necessary modernization. We make television shows. We build museum displays. We wear the velvet and the gold in reenactments and call it heritage, but we do not ask what it means that a man could die in screaming seizures, leaking infection into the walls of an abbey, and still be remembered as a founder of modern England. We do not ask what it says about us that we built a national identity on the myth of control, when the man at the center of that myth lost control of his body, his mind, and his soul years before we let him go, because to us that would mean unburying him, not physically, but mythically would mean reopening the coffin that has bulged beneath our history books for 500 years, peeling back the layers of tar and linen and narrative, and looking directly at what we have chosen to forget, that Henry VIII was not just a king, but a man who died horrifically, grotesquely, painfully, and whose death tells us more about power than his reign ever did, because in the end, it was not the wars or the wives or the reforms that defined him. It was the death, the Zeiture, the screams, the ulcer that tore open in the night, the dog that licked the stain, the servant who fled, the coffin that could not hold, the silence that followed. And so, if there is a lesson here, if there is anything to be learned from the body that exploded beneath the floor of Sion Abbey, and the legacy that collapsed beneath the weight of its own lies, it is this: that power without limits breeds monsters. And that monsters, no matter how golden their portraits, no matter how loud their anthems, will always eventually rot. And when they do not rot alone. They rot everything. They touch their families, their nations, their myths. They rot until the walls must be rebuilt, the paintings retouched, the words rewritten, and even then, somewhere beneath the marble, beneath the wax and the ceremony, there is still that sound, that thunderous, wet sound of rupture, reminding us that no body lasts forever, not even the body of a king, not even the body of England itself. And that perhaps is the death England truly buried.